This is Farrakhan Norris supporting black businesses, and we welcome you to the nation of black entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Farrakhan Norris. Some additional educational topics for the nation of black entrepreneurs will be on taxes as well. Things to help you better yourself, whether you're working or you start a business. So pretty much stay tuned.
Well, starting in about 1800 and going up through about the time of the Civil War, during peacetime, the U.S. government financed its operations through just two means. One was tariffs, and the other was the sale of public lands. So that's it. There were no other taxes, no other excise taxes. There's certainly no income tax, the very idea of which would have horrified everyone. But with the 20th century, there began to be a move for a progressive income tax. And the rationale for this was that the tariff was contributing to the monopoly problem. The tariff was viewed as being the enemy of the common man. So we'll get rid of the tariff or lower it dramatically and replace it with an income tax that's going to be paid only by rich people. You're never going to pay this tax, so don't worry about it. Now, what in fact happened was they did lower the tariff, they did introduce the income tax, and then in the 1920s, they raised the tariff again. So it's what I warn people about when they say, well, I want this kind of tax or that kind of tax. You know, at the very least, abolish the first one permanently before you introduce anything else. I would rather just abolish, because they're always going to pull something like this. And incidentally, on the floor of Congress, there was somebody who warned that maybe the tax rate ought to be capped in the amendment at 10%, the 16th Amendment that became part of the Constitution, so that no one ever has to pay more than 10% of his income. And people laughed at that, said, it's never going to get to 10%. Come on, what are you, crazy? Whereas as soon as World War I came along, we had very, very substantial tax increases, so that in the 1920s, they were reducing the tax burden from tax rates that were in top marginal rates that were in the 70s, and then again later they were returned to the 70s, to the low 90s, in the 1960s, top marginal rates. This was something that was true all over the world, very, very high top marginal rates. That's why George Harrison wrote the song Tax Man. 'Cause I'm the tax man. For the Beatles, there's 1 for you, 19 for me.
How did we ever get into this situation where taxes are a never-ending hole that we continue to fill up? Well, today, or this week, is the 100th anniversary of the income tax. We thought we might take a look back and show you how we got to where we are today, to the status of the income tax. Where we started originally was at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and the Constitution did lay out that Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes for the general welfare. It talked about the excise tax and duties and so forth, but it didn't say much about income tax. In fact, it said this specifically. It said that Congress does not have the power to collect direct taxes. We can put that up for you. Exactly what it has to say. No capitation or other direct taxes shall be laid. Capitation, that's a word for direct taxes for being present, like everyone present has to pay a tax, unless it's enumerated and apportioned according to the states. That's specifically what it said. Now, in that 1787 Constitutional Convention, a guy named Rufus King stood up and said, hey, what's a direct tax? Well, the record shows no one answered him, and we've been trying to figure it out ever since. In 1864, in the Civil War, we finally inducted a little bit of an income tax. We needed it to fund for it. So Congress enacted the Revenue Act of 1964, and it brought in an income tax of about 5%. Raised it twice, eventually got the top rate up to 10%. But by 1872, they'd done enough. They'd had enough of that. Got rid of the income tax. Still, there was this hunger to see more of the tax burden fall on the rich. So in 1894, Congress enacted an income tax for the first time statutorily and set it at 2%. But this only hit about those that made over $40,000 a year. That was 85,000 households, less than 1%. This act, this 1894 act, went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said no, that is not constitutional. That is a direct tax. So what did Congress do? They came back, such a hunger for a progressive income tax. In 1913, they enacted the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment, which reads, we can put that up for you as well. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on income from whatever source derived without apportionment and among the several states without regard to any census or numeration. Gave them the power to tax people directly on their income. And I just want to show you, this is the top marginal income tax rate over the past 100 years. Peaks in World War I, above 80%. World War II, again, higher. Doesn't drop until President Reagan comes in, brings it back down below 30%. Here's the question I want to ask you guys. We can look at our history and say, look, we have a longer history without the income tax than we do with the income tax. But was this inevitable? Was this thing constantly headed for an income tax? Can you think of a society today that survives without the income tax? Better yet, a government.
Well, I would say that, for one thing, the tax code as it stands now is kind of a monument to corruption and special interests, right? It's, what is it, a couple of million words? 4 million words.
4 million words.
Clearly doesn't have to be that long. Clearly it's only that long so people can hide things in there, lard it with again, special interest stuff. Look, there are some countries, I think, that have a very different way of doing this, Russia being one of them. Russia has a flat tax, believe it or not, as much as it's a corrupt place and you got all the kleptocracy going on. But we should have a one-page document or a 5-page document that lays this all out. It shouldn't be as long as it is, because that's just a way to hide the corruption.
Technology-wise, in the last 100 years, it's gotten smaller, easier to use. As you mentioned, 4 million words, 74,000 pages in the tax code? I mean, that's one of the few things in the last 100 years that's getting larger and more complicated.
By the way, 1913, when this was enacted, 13 pages.
And you know, in 1913, when this was enacted, if you made $4,000, your tax rate after deductions was 1%. In inflation terms, you're looking at about $100,000 in today's terms. We're paying 25% now versus 1%. So keep that in mind, that when this was enacted, it really wasn't that high. It was just kind of to get by. If we've now gone 25 times higher, even though we've come down quite a bit, still 25 times higher in the last 100 years.
But that's also because we're asking our federal government to do so much more for us. So I don't think that there's going to be any, credible movement afoot to get rid of the federal income tax. But you asked, are there societies that do without the income tax? Sure. At the state level, we see that state governments, they figure out ways to tax their citizens. So it is sort of more direct, that you're taxing for direct services rather than just for the general functioning of the state government.
Yeah, you're right. It's directly tied to what you're asking the government to do. The answer to my question, by the way, there are some societies that survive without the income tax. There are Bahrain, Qatar,
Monaco?
Monaco. They're usually ones that sit on vast oceans of oil. But I don't know. We consider and lament the income tax. I don't know that politically there's ever going to be a consistent or sincere tax reform proposal.
Yeah, certainly not now. If there were ever a time for tax reform, it would have been over the past few years with all of these discussions of let's sort of address the deficit, the debt, and the fiscal unhealthiness of the country. And of course, no one is politically willing. But I think if you see more governors like Bobby Jindal coming out and saying let's abolish the income tax, and you see more states getting themselves back in the black by virtue of only paying for the services that they actually use, you might start to see a federal movement toward ending income tax. I think of it in terms of the way my parents told me about income tax when I was a child. And this can be instructive. When you're a child and you're told, well, you're going to work really hard, and the harder you work, the more money your government's going to take away. It's completely anathema, and it's really hard to bring yourself back to 1913 and imagine the country in a state of mind where they said, yes, tax the money that I'm working hard on, and people sort of let that go.
Trying to argue that governmental action is not forceful, Senator Harry Reid claimed that income taxes are voluntary. If the government is in the business of forcefully taking money from some people in order to provide welfare benefits to others, how will the people whose money is being taken feel about the government?
Well, I don't accept your phraseology. I don't think we force people.
Taxation is not forceful?
Well, no.
It's voluntary?
In fact, quite to the contrary. Our system of government is a voluntary tax system.
Oh, if you don't want to pay your taxes, you don't have to?
Oh, of course you have to pay your taxes. But
well, the government will force you to pay, or they'll fine you or imprison you.
We have a voluntary system. the fact of the matter is that if when you pay your taxes, see, in many other countries it's not voluntary. For example, in many countries, the government makes sure that your employer takes out every penny. Many countries don't file income tax returns.
We have
Why?
withholding here too, don't we?
Pardon me?
Withholding?
With some programs, yes, but I'm talking about in some countries, European countries as an example, you don't file an income tax return. There is no need to, because your employer takes all the money out. That's the difference between a voluntary and an involuntary system. You can't cheat and not pay your taxes,
Right.
but I don't accept your phraseology that you forcibly take money from somebody else and give it to that's the way it is on any program.
Can the taxpayer...
highway program is the same.
Excuse me.
We take money, we forcibly take money in your phraseology
But
from people
let
and
me
build
ask you this
highways
question.
with it. Put people in the Army.
Can the taxpayer decide not to pay his taxes if he wants?
He can not pay his taxes. He
What
wants.
will happen?
He's subject to civil and criminal penalties.
They'll put him in jail. They use force against him. He pays. Everybody pays taxes under threat of jail or fine, under threat of force. In other words, you are forced to pay your taxes, whether you fill out your form voluntarily or whether it's withheld by your employer. You don't have a choice on whether you can pay taxes that are going to be used for welfare programs. You can't make that choice.
Well, but the reason our system is called a voluntary tax system, and I recognize, that ultimately you can't cheat in your taxes, but we have many provisions in the law they don't have in most countries. We have deductibility for home, interest on mortgage payment. They don't have that in most countries. We have deductibility for certain excessive expenses as it relates to health, doctors, hospitals. We have all kinds of tax, some people call them loopholes, but others would call them incentives for people to do business. And that's why you're not forced to pay certain tax. There are ways, if you decide to buy a home.
You can decide not to pay taxes in the United States?
I mean, I really don't understand what you're trying to get at. What the point of the matter is...
Because you objected to my phraseology. You say that the government isn't forcefully taking money from some people to provide welfare benefits to others. And in fact, that's what it's doing, because all taxation is forceful. It's backed up by physical force. If you don't pay your taxes, the government will intervene with you forcefully. So you don't have a choice. It's not voluntary. You can't decide not to pay and not suffer a consequence. If you don't pay, you'll go to jail.
Well,
you're forced to pay.
You don't go to jail. Some people go to jail. There are all kinds of civil penalties. If you don't pay your taxes, you pay interest and you pay penalties. The fact of the matter is, our system is a voluntary system.
If they are endowed with unalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward but backward.
All right, time has expired. Mr. Becerra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your testimony. And let me key off of something, Mr. Miller, you said. You said foolish mistakes were made. I think the President actually said it better. He said that the handling of those tax-exempt applications in that process at the IRS was outrageous and intolerable. No excuse. And as much as we know that the folks at IRS have a thankless job because they have to go and tell their fellow Americans that they may be audited or they have to do this work understaffed, we have to maintain the confidence in the system because it's a voluntary system of payment of our taxes.
Agreed.
And so you are right, it was a foolish mistake, but the President's even more correct that it was outrageous. It was a foolish mistake, but the President's even more correct that it was outrageous and intolerable. Now, let me also focus on something, Mr. George, you said. When you were asked, was there any finding or evidence of political motivation here, you said no.
That's correct, sir.
Okay. And so what we find is a situation where inexcusable activity took place because erodes the confidence of the American people in a system where they participate voluntarily. And if there's a place in public service where you have to have the highest level of conduct and standards, it's at the IRS. And so, Mr. Miller, I think it's unfortunate for those who are in positions of authority, but the buck has to stop somewhere, and I think that's exactly what we're saying. That should not diminish the good work that has been done by anyone within the IRS over the years. And so I hope you understand that you are here today talking to us because we need to get to the bottom of this. We need to clean up and clear out so we can go back to the business of making sure that people respect the fact that we have a voluntary system of paying our taxes.
Learn the stuff they don't want you to know. Here are the facts. In the United States, taxation is a touchy subject. The income tax system as we know it began with the ratification of the 16th Amendment in 1913. Today, some voters believe people don't pay enough tax, and others believe people pay too much. One thing's for sure, you can count on taxes being a hot-button issue in every U.S. election. While people don't always agree on what exactly is wrong with the current tax system, most folks will agree it's far from perfect. However, some take this a step further. Not only is the system broken, they argue, but it's not even legal. Here's where it gets crazy. People who refuse to pay tax because they consider it illegal are known as tax protesters. In numerous court cases, these protesters have refused to pay taxes for a number of reasons, usually based in some way on the perceived constitutional basis of income tax or the lack thereof. The theory goes like this. During some point in U.S. history, the federal government either abolished income tax or ceased to exist entirely, and all of the tax collected since is part of a nationwide conspiracy. Some protesters believe the government passed a debt threshold in the Constitution during a traumatic historic event such as the Great Depression or the Civil War, and that this debt triggered the abolition of the federal government. The goal of this conspiracy changes depending on whom you ask. To protesters such as William Cooper, the income tax conspiracy aims to redistribute wealth, creating a classless society and propagating communism. To others, the goal of the tax system masters echo those of shadowy organizations so common in conspiracy theories, such as the Freemasons or the Illuminati. And tax protesters take their grievances to court. In fact, protesters have earned a reputation for being notoriously litigious, and the IRS has dedicated a section of their website to specifically dismissing the protesters' claims. Consider the Admiralty Court argument that the type of flag a court uses may determine whether the court is capable of ruling in tax cases. If the U.S. flag in a court is fringed with gold, it is considered by some a signal that the trial is being held in an admiralty or military court. Others have focused on the use of the term voluntary. To tax protesters, voluntary means that citizens must elect to file tax returns. Other protesters have argued that printing their names in all capital letters refers to a different entity or person, as they do not capitalize their names in conventional use. Protesters have also argued that the U.S. has switched to fiat currency and that they are not required to pay taxes using this tender. These arguments all have one thing in common: the belief that the government is taking advantage of uninformed citizens and that a person with enough knowledge of the law may avoid paying taxes. So how does the government react to these claims? Not well. In multiple cases, the courts have rejected these arguments as frivolous. According to the IRS, the word voluntary refers to the system of allowing taxpayers initially to determine the correct amount of tax and complete the appropriate returns rather than having the government determine tax for them. To mainstream America, these protesters are radical conspiracy theorists. The protesters argue that the average American simply doesn't understand the legal situation and that the government is breaking the law. And according to the tax protesters, that's the basic question. Is the IRS spending millions a year to enforce the law, or is there something they don't want you to know?
I really expected that, of course there's a law that you can point to in the law book, the code, that requires you to file a tax return. Of course there is. Maybe I don't know what it is right then as he was speaking to me, but sure. So naively, I agreed to go off and research it and get back to him. 3.5 months later, I was at that point where I couldn't find the statute that clearly made a person liable, at least not me and most people I know, and I had no choice in my mind except to resign.
I had to leave the IRS because I presented evidence that I had accumulated indicating that the agency was violating the law and violating people's rights. And I asked the agency for a response to my sincere concerns. And the answer I got was that they would not respond to my concerns and that they would provide me with the paperwork necessary to tender my resignation.
But We the People Foundation for Constitutional Education put a full-page ad in the USA Today on July 7, 2000. And within the body of that ad was a $50,000 challenge for anyone that could show the law. And to me, $50,000 is a lot of money. So I went after that and did the research based on the fact that I thought, let's put this baby to bed. I'm hearing all these rumors. You know, I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. I'll answer these people's questions that are asking me, and then I'll win this $50,000. And, you know, based on the research that I did throughout the year 2000 and that I'm still doing, I have not found that law. I've asked Congress, we've asked a lot of people in the IRS commissioners, helpers. They can't answer, because if they answer, the American people are going to know that this whole thing is a fraud.
I was surprised to hear these highly trained and decorated IRS agents telling me there was no law requiring American citizens to file a 1040 or to pay an income tax on their labor.
I haven't filed an federal income tax return since I left.
I have not filed a tax return since 1999. Approximately 67 million people don't file an income tax return.
Why do you think you've been able to get away with not paying or filing your income taxes for so long?
Well, first of all, I've not gotten away with anything. I'm not hiding from anyone. I'm simply asking the IRS to show me the laws that apparently require me to do these things, and they are suspiciously reticent to answer questions from me, and of course there are millions of other people, many other organizations who have attempted to get answers. They act very suspiciously when asked to simply sit down at the table with the American people and discuss what their obligations are. Rather than pulling up a chair, they pull out a club.
There is no law that requires the average American worker in the private sector to pay a direct, unapportioned tax on their labor and compensation for services. There is no law.
When President Reagan was elected, one of the first things that he did was appoint a blue ribbon panel of business people headed by Peter Grace, and is commonly referred to as the Grace Commission. And their job was to research all the various areas of the federal government and make a report. One of the quotes from the Grace Commission is, 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by interest on the federal debt. All individual income tax revenues are gone before 1 nickel is spent on the services taxpayers expect from government. They've been brainwashed. People have been told, you know, that you need this income tax system to fund government, which is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, my question is, well, if that's true, how did we fund government from 1776 to 1913?
Every year, you give the federal government a form that says, here's how my money worked. If you lie, you could go to prison. So you're required to give them a financial statement that under, you know, the force of law could put you in prison if it's not impeccable, right? And under the law, they're supposed to do the same. They're supposed to give you back a financial statement that says, here's what we did with your money. Except you comply and they don't. In fiscal 99, the Department of Defense had $1.1 trillion of undocumentable adjustments. The following year, they had $2.3 trillion of undocumentable adjustments.
A lot of people might say, well, gee, if there wasn't an income tax, what would happen to education? They don't understand that education is paid for the most part, out of state and local taxes, your property tax. People might say, well, how are we going to build and maintain our highways if there's no money coming into the government? We need our highways. There is a tax on every gallon of gasoline that people buy. proceeds from the income tax do not pay for highway construction. The amount of money that we spend on defense is exactly equal to the amount of corporate income tax, which is quite legal and quite constitutional.
These liens that are recorded against people by the government for tax liens are nothing more than allegations. They are non-substantive. They have never been determined by a neutral third party, such as a court, to have one shred of validity.
If you ever get a notice of an audit or anything else, the first thing you should do is a Freedom of Information Act request for records that they're using to substantiate or justify the audit.
They're calling us tax cheats, they're calling us fanatics, they're calling us weirdos. I don't care what you call me, but I have one question. Where is the law? Show me the law.
In November 2004, the government arrested former IRS criminal investigator Joe Bannister. They charged him with fraud for telling the American people the truth about the income tax laws. The jury obviously agreed with Joe.
Well, it just showed Mr. Bannister to be honest and straightforward and working within the law.
Vernice Kuglin, a Federal Express pilot, claimed there was no law requiring Americans to file an income tax. She also won in court. 24 people were criminally charged by the IRS because they claimed there was no law requiring them to file an income tax return.
The fact is, neither the judge, nor the prosecutor, nor the IRS could bring that statute in there because it's not in the books. The jury came back with an acquittal for everyone.
This world is such a, and when I say this world, I mean it. I don't mean in an ideal sense. I mean in every day, every little thing you do. It's such a, gimme, gimme, gimme. Everybody back off. You know, everybody's like, you taught that from school, everywhere. Big business, you want to be successful, you want to be like Trump, gimme, 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 push, 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 step, 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 crush, crush, crush. That's how it all is. And it's like, nobody ever stopped. Just, you know, I feel like, instead of us just being like, slavery's bad, slavery's down, bad whitey, bad whitey. I mean, all right, let's stop that. And everybody's smart enough to know that, I mean, we've been slighted. And we want ours. Now America's got jewels and they paid and everything and they lending money to everybody except us. And it's like, you know, everybody need a little help on their way to being, you know, self-reliant. You know what I'm saying? That's the whole thing about the album, about the Special Olympics. Everybody need a little something and to be independent. No independent person just grew up and was born independent. You worked and you learned teamwork and you learned cooperation and unity and struggle, and then you became independent. And we have to teach that and instill that. And why is it that they want to do that? I mean, if this is truly a melting pot in the country where we care about it and Lady Liberty got a hand like this, she really loves us, then we really need to be like that. And it needs to be the black kids. If there's a white person who got money, then he need to help them. He need to help black kids, Mexican kids, Korean kids, whatever. But it need to be real. And it need to be before we all die and then you say, oh, I made a mistake. We should have gave them some money. We really should have helped these folks. It's going to be too late. You know what I'm saying? And then that's when you got to pay your own karma. And that's when God make you punish. When God punishes you. Because I feel like, you know, it's too much money here. We got people starving in the streets.
Okay, so there it is.